So my therapist actually recommended that I read up on the concept of highly sensitive people for myself personally. So I did. I picked up this book, The Highly Sensitive Person by Elaine Aron, who is the creator of the construct Highly Sensitive Person. And I did score quite high in her questionnaire of what makes someone an HSP. I found some of it validating. I had a couple of doubts about the construct as a whole, and then I went to go look at the science on this topic a little bit more closely. So today that's what I'm going to be sharing with you. My thoughts on this book after taking a closer look at the science, and specifically if you yourself relate to the concept of a highly sensitive person, a few tips for how to make the most of this concept without getting into murky waters. Also, a reminder, my second novel, A Song at Dead Man's Cove, which is a gothic horror novel set in coastal Washington with a lot of siren folklore and dual timelines, one in the modern era, one in the Victorian era, will be releasing this June, so make sure you are subscribed to my email newsletter so that you can be notified as soon as it is. You can find that on my website, drannayuden.com. Without further ado, let's talk about highly sensitive people. So what is an HSP? According to Aron herself, you can kind of memorize what an HSP entails with the acronym DOES. D is for depth of processing. HSPs, she says, process everything more. For example, when I'm out and about, I notice things more closely. And I think that's part of what helps me so much as a writer is I notice the little things that other people tend to ignore. So I'll notice, for instance, a pearlescent dewdrop on the leaf of a rose bush, or the scent of somebody unwrapping a clementine a couple rows down on the plane. I'll notice those things and I'll make a note of them and I'll really try to think about them deeply and connect them to other experiences that I have in order to form a creative narrative in my writing. And Aron says HSPs may be slower to react because of this deeper processing of information where they're kind of thinking over all their options. Then the O stands for overstimulated easily. Because HSPs notice things more deeply, they're more easily overstimulated, and this leads to fatigue or exhaustion and a need to kind of pull back and retreat. Social stimulation is also a big one here. A lot of HSPs become very overwhelmed in social situations because there is so much stimulation in those situations, and that's why they tend to get very socially depleted after social interactions. The E stands for emphasis to emotional reactions and also empathy. HSPs tend to react more strongly to both positive and negative experiences. They tend to notice subtleties in other people that make them more attuned to those people's emotions. They have particularly active mirror neurons, according to neuroscientific studies, and they also have more pronounced activity in the areas suggest wanting to resolve another person's pain. So there is some evidence there that they have maybe higher than average empathy, likely because they are noticing other people more deeply. And then the S stands for sensitive to environmental subtleties. HSPs, for instance, can be more easily bothered by loud sounds, bright lights. Ambulance sirens can be much more upsetting for an HSP versus someone who's not an HSP. They might have a little bit of a startle response because everything is just kind of turned up a notch. All the sensory information is just a little bit more intense for HSPs. Now, Aron estimates that HSPs comprise about 15 to 20% of the population. Scientific research puts it a little bit closer to 30%. And also in a clinical population, it's more like 50%. So out of the people going to therapy, there's a higher likelihood that those people are HSPs. Now, I told you Aron's definition, but let's talk about some definitions from the scientific literature. An HSP is somebody with sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS. Sensory processing sensitivity is the tendency to notice more subtle variations in information, which results in greater sensitivity to stimuli, greater depth of processing of stimuli, and increased emotional response. So all those components that we just talked about from the acronym DOES. And there's this theory called environmental sensitivity, which is the idea that people lie on a spectrum in terms of their sensitivity to environmental stimuli. HSPs would be on the higher end of that spectrum. Now, there tend to be at least two clusters of HSPs. There are those who had early childhood negative experiences, and then their sensory processing sensitivity went on to be more of a vulnerability. These people tend to be a little bit more neurotic, to struggle more with their mental health. And then there are HSPs who had very positive early experiences. And for those individuals, sensory processing sensitivity can actually be a strength. And those people tend to be more extroverted and more confident. But it's not just about environmental stimuli either, because one definition of sensory processing sensitivity described it as a personality characterized by sensitivity towards both exogenous and endogenous stimuli, meaning not just what's coming from the outside, but also stimuli from within you. So for instance, HSPs are more sensitive to their own heart racing or symptoms of physiological arousal, which means they might be more likely to misattribute their physical arousal for social anxiety, for instance. Both Aaron and the research as a whole agree that being an HSP can be both or either a gift and a curse. It's not something to fix or pathologize. It's not something to create a disorder out of, but society often does pathologize it and often does make it seem like you're strange if you're sensitive to sensory information and you need time to wind down on your own after being overstimulated, which actually makes it harder on HSPs to exist in the world. But being an HSP can very much be a strength, like how I was talking about how I think it makes me a much better writer, and I wouldn't trade that for the world. But it also comes with certain aspects that you might need to cope with in your day-to-day life. So some of the positive aspects of being an HSP means you notice really life-saving environmental cues, you have a greater appreciation for beauty and art, you're more attuned to social cues, you have a deeper sense of reflectiveness, and some of the negative aspects are you're easily exhausted by overstimulation, including social stimulation. You may need to recharge often, and sometimes you might emotionally overreact to things. And Aaron argues that it can either be inborn, it can be sort of this temperament that you're born with from the moment you come out as a baby, or it can be created by less than ideal childhood experiences. And it can also be associated with lower self-esteem and more insecure attachment style, especially for those people who have a history of adverse experiences during childhood. Now, the biggest issue and the biggest question in the field of HSPs is this too similar to other constructs? For example, this concept of sensory processing sensitivity is strongly associated with neuroticism, particularly in those with troubled childhoods, but not in those with happy childhoods. Like I said, those people are actually better off than the general population. But this is pretty clear, they are by no means the same thing. Just because they are correlated does not mean they are referring to the same construct, as evidenced by the fact that some HSPs are high in neuroticism and some are actually lower in neuroticism. Some people have also suggested that it's very closely linked to the concept of introversion. And I will say that while I was reading Aaron's book, there were a lot of times where I thought this sounds a lot like Susan Cain's book, Quiet, which is all about introversion. Now, the confusion there is caused by the fact that introversion is this tendency to turn inward, and it actually originated from Carl Jung. When HSPs process very deeply or when they feel overstimulated, they often turn inward. They take that information that they're processing and they do a lot with it internally. And if they're feeling overstimulated by that sensory information, they may need to recharge by being alone or being in a less stimulating environment. So that's where the confusion comes in. But again, introversion and being an HSP are not the same thing. Yes, the majority of HSPs, 70%, are introverts, but that also means that 30% of them are extroverts, so they're not the same thing. There's also a conflation between being an HSP and social anxiety or shyness. The confusion here is caused by the fact that social overstimulation can often look like social anxiety. So for instance, for me, when I'm meeting a new person, it's difficult for me to remember their name because I'm so overstimulated in the moment when I'm meeting someone new. And that at face value could be social anxiety, but it could also be being sensitive to sensory information. Now, the issue with HSPs taking on this label of I'm just shy or I'm socially anxious as a person is that it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy when it doesn't really need to be, when the issue is actually sensory processing sensitivity. The concept of HSPs has also received some criticism from people who say it's just repackaged autism, and that the way people differentiate between the two relies on mischaracterizations of autism, such as saying that people with autism have low empathy or have social deficits. These critics argue that many of the people who identify as HSPs could be masking autism, and likely many of those are women since we know women tend to mask more. And there does seem to be some overlap with autism. Sensitivity to sensory stimulation, easily being overstimulated, often feeling like an outsider, often exhibiting unique gifts like how autistic people are sometimes savants. And it doesn't help that some of the people Erin based her HSP profile on later turned out to be autistic. The issue is, though, there are also some really key differences between autism and being an HSP. For example, autistic people do often experience sensory overload, but in other situations, they also underreact to sensory stimulation. And in one study, the brain scans actually revealed two very different types of brain activity for HSPs versus autistic people. For HSPs, the areas of processing social cues were actually overactive, whereas for people with autism, there was far less activation in those areas. And autism spectrum disorder also encompasses a lot of other symptoms that appear to be unrelated to HSPs, like having very specific interests, echolalia, repetitive behaviors like stimming, ritualized routines. Also, going back to the example of myself, I myself am not autistic. I've been in therapy for 15 years and no therapist has ever suggested that about me, even therapists who are actually quite well versed in masking autism, but I do seem to fit the mold for being an HSP. So I think this idea that it's just repackaged autism, it doesn't fully capture the differences between the two. There might be an overlap, there might be people who are both, there might be people who say they're one thing but really they're the other, but at the end of the day, they are two different constructs in my opinion. Being an HSP is also different from having sensory processing disorder, which is not an official diagnosis in either the DSM or the ICD, but it has been used as kind of a catch-all to describe sensory sensitivities that exist outside of autism. Erin makes sure to mention it is not the same thing. Sensory processing disorder is a disorder, whereas being an HSP is a neutral temperament, not a disorder. Sensory processing disorder typically results in impairment in functioning and/or distress, whereas simply being an HSP could be, again, either a source of strength or vulnerability. And then also, I think the concept of being an HSP is tangentially related to the concept of what people call empaths. Look, people score higher and lower on a spectrum of empathy. So of course, the people on the far extreme of that spectrum are going to have higher amounts of empathy than the rest of us. I've historically criticized the concept of empaths, not because I don't think empaths exist. Obviously, like I just said, I do think they exist, but because I think a lot of the people cloaking themselves in the label of empath tend to weaponize the label, and from my personal experience are often just people discovering mild levels of empathy and assuming that other people don't feel that way. You know, I have noticed in my own personal life, the people calling themselves empaths are typically the ones who are actually more narcissistic and lower in empathy. And I think that's because a truly empathic person is not going to feel empathy and assume, wow, I feel empathy so much more deeply than other people. A truly empathic person isn't going to automatically just compare their experience to others. They're actually going to feel more for the other person's experience. But this conflation between HSPs and empaths is caused by the fact that, again, HSPs notice social cues more. They're more attentive to how other people might be feeling, and they also tend to feel those emotions more deeply, tend to have more heightened empathy. But for HSPs, it's about more than just empathy. It's not just having higher amounts of empathy, it's also about being more sensitive to stimulation in general. Now, despite everything that I just said, there does seem to be some support for the validity of the construct of an HSP. A study from 2019 found high internal consistency of the HSP scale, substantial evidence for concurrent validity. The subscales were a little less reliable, and test-retest reliability was not available for these studies. There's also some evidence for cross-cultural adaptation of the concept of an HSP. In one study, they gave a Spanish version of the reduced HSP scale, and it showed adequate reliability. Neurobiological evidence has also shown that HSPs have specific brain patterns that would characterize them as neuroatypical or neurodivergent, which this is actually going to be a really flaming hot take that I'm sure a lot of you will disagree with me on, but I actually don't love the concept of neurodivergence because it assumes that there is like a normal type of brain. And I think when you learn about how different disorders affect the brain anatomically or functionally or chemically, you realize that there's really so much variation. You know, a person who's depressed has a brain like this, a person who's anxious has a brain like this, a person with autism, an HSP, like everybody's brain looks so different that I don't think there is such a thing as a normal brain pattern. and a neurodivergent brain pattern, but I'll get off my soapbox for today because that's not the point. But let's talk about some of the critiques of this concept. Despite some evidence that HSP is a separate construct, some people have argued that it's still vague as a concept and not super clearly delineated from other constructs. Is it just a repackaging of other traits? Like I said, it does seem to be a separate construct from a lot of the other constructs that it's conflated with. There are some studies to show that it has good validity. This has been a burgeoning field of research over the past 20 years, but more empirical research is still very much needed to substantiate its legitimacy. For instance, it definitely does not have enough scientific merit to get included in the DSM as a concept. Another piece of criticism it's received is that it medicalizes a normal temperamental variation. Some critics have argued that creating this term HSP can medicalize what is actually a pretty normal phenomenon if it exists in 30% of the population. I don't think this is an entirely fair critique because Erin herself constantly preaches that being an HSP is not something to pathologize, not something to medicalize. It can be either a strength or a vulnerability depending on the situation, and our society makes it harder on HSPs than it needs to. With that said, I do think that people will always try to run with a label and try to self-medicalize to try to make it seem like they're more special than the rest of the population. So I think the potential for it becoming medicalized is there, even if its very founder has warned against that. The concept of HSP also has potential to be weaponized for people who want to get out of things that they don't want to do. You know, for example, somebody choosing to be just like not a great friend or partner or family member, whatever it is, because, well, I'm overstimulated, so I need to go be by myself for a week. Although, again, Erin advocates against this. She advocates towards a more balanced approach in which HSPs both honor their needs and also push themselves outside their comfort zone. But again, that doesn't mean that people aren't still going to weaponize the concept. For instance, I read that apparently Kanye identifies as an HSP, which is not altogether surprising to me, considering now he's also using autism as an excuse for the absolutely abhorrent things that he's doing. Problematic people will always weaponize certain concepts to try to get out of accountability. That's just kind of the way it is. I don't think this is necessarily a reason to dismiss the concept as a whole. I just think it's something to be mindful of and to not let people get away with doing that. I personally also found myself feeling just like a teeny bit uncomfortable with the way Erin was romanticizing the construct a little bit in her book and framing HSPs as the class of priests and priestesses historically and to some extent in modern times as well. Again, I don't think that having a specific label makes you a special snowflake or so much better than the rest of people. Does being an HSP maybe predispose you to more intense spiritual experiences? Sure, maybe that could be the case, but I don't think we need to mantle ourselves in this identity as like the priest class of humanity. And also there is the potential for mislabeling when it comes to HSPs. Because of the similarity to other constructs, somebody might make being an HSP their whole personality without first going to professionals to rule out genuine diagnoses like autism spectrum disorder or social anxiety, which, if that is the case, makes it harder for them to get the treatment that they need. So the bottom line is, if you identify with the description of an HSP, be aware that this is still a growing field of research. We're not quite sure where the lines are drawn between this construct and other similar constructs. If you want to just keep it really objective, instead of like taking on this identity of I'm an HSP, just say I'm a person who's sensitive to sensory stimulation, because that's less of a label and more just a description of the situation that could actually encompass multiple labels. And make sure that it's not actually masking a completely separate clinical issue. Make sure that you are getting clinical issues ruled out. Also, don't use it as a crutch. Even if you are an HSP, you still have to sometimes do things that are overstimulating for you. Don't pathologize or medicalize what's a perfectly normal temperament. Try to lean into the ways in which it could be a strength for you, actually. But otherwise, if the term makes you feel seen, helps you better understand yourself, helps you take better care of yourself, helps you find people who struggle with similar issues, then go right ahead and use it. I think as far as the research goes, you have a good case to make for HSP being a real construct. I know for me personally, I do feel it brought me some value to realize that I probably would fall in the category of an HSP, but this isn't something that's going to be like coloring my every human experience from here on out, because I am more than just one thing. Let me know what you thought about this concept in the comments down below, and I'll see you soon.